Hello, and welcome to the late night. So today I want to spend some time on what you might call more serious chess analysis. I had some fun in my last video, which was on my bullet chess repertoire. So the topic of today's video is key squares in symmetrical positions. So obviously the idea of a symmetrical position is a very broad one. The starting position, for example, is completely symmetrical. So I want to focus on a category of symmetrical positions that comes up quite a lot. And this is what you can see on the board here. Symmetrical positions with one open file in the center. So the pawn structure you see here with the open D file, and these structures can arise from a lot of different openings. The specific one we're looking at here will occur from the Caro-Kann opening in some of the variations we're looking at. This pawn can be back on c7, and this pawn could be on e5, in which case we'd be looking at probably a king's pawn opening, like the Gioco Piano, the bishop's opening. So various different openings can let you end up in these positions. Another example would be in the exchange French. So if you can imagine, if instead of an open D file, we had an open E file, the exchange French would end up in a kind of mirror image of this position. So I first got the idea of lumping all these positions together from Sergei Tivyakov, who I've mentioned before. So his book, Rock Solid Chess, has a chapter on positions with one open file in the center. I've not really borrowed any material from that chapter because I've got some material from my own games, and I've also got a particular perspective on these positions that I want to share in these videos. So I want to talk very specifically about the fight for key squares in these symmetrical positions. So you can see on the board here, I'll just get rid of some of these highlights. I've highlighted the squares c4 and c5. And these are key squares from both players' perspective. Now, the reason for this, if you like to have a look at the board and divide it up, you can see that we have a short side and a long side. So we use the phrase short side when it comes to short side castling or long side castling. But I also like to use it in relation to these structures to refer to the short side, which is the side that has 3 pawns on it facing each other, and the long side, which has 4 pawns facing each other. And it's just a convenient way of thinking about it, because in these positions, generally, someone is going to be trying to make their play on the short side, and someone is going to be trying to make their play on the long side. And my basic idea is that whoever gets to position their pieces more favorably on the short side is usually the one who has the advantage and is pushing, or you could say has the initiative. So in these positions, these squares are very, very important. If you could, for example, get knights, if you're white and you could get knights outposted on c4 and c5, you're generally going to have a very powerful position. And therefore, although symmetrical positions like this can seem boring, especially with the queens off, I would have, in my previous chess life, I probably would have dismissed positions like this as being kind of dull and boring and drawish. In fact, the element of time is really important in these positions. because getting your pieces to the right places to fight for these squares as soon as possible is really important. The first player to get to these squares usually is going to have an advantage or an initiative. And therefore the time element is very important, just like it is in gambits where you might sacrifice a pawn. And tempi are very important. Tempi are actually very important in symmetrical positions with the queens off. Another key concept in these positions to get your head around is what pieces do you want to try and exchange and what pieces do you want to leave on the board. And this very much depends on where the other pawns get placed. So in these types of positions, for example, let's play some moves. So often you might end up with this kind of structure after a few moves have been played. Now, in this position, what you'll notice is that black has set up on the dark squares and white is set up, has a lot of control of light squares. So in these positions, in this structure, white is going to try and exchange his light squared bishop for black's light squared bishop, which will expose all these light square weaknesses. And white's ultimate dream will be to exchange all of the pieces off and leave black with a bad dark squared bishop against, a good white knight, which will either be on c4 or d5. Now, this will all be completely different if black chooses a different setup. So if, for example, black started putting his pawns on the light squares and setting up this way, then all of a sudden it'll be the other way around and you would want to leave black with a bad light squared bishop. So it all depends on exactly how the position goes, but it's one of the key things to watch out for. We're just going to have a quick look here. So this is the ideal placement of pieces that white should be going for in this specific type of position. Now again, details are going to vary. It's going to depend on what black does. But if you got absolutely everything you wanted, you would have these lovely bishops. The best place for the light squared, dark squared bishop is almost always going to be on e3 or f2, where it has fantastic scope and pressures the queen side. So everything for white here is about pressuring the black queen side. The bishops support ideal knight outposts on c4 and c5. If you can get your knights looking like this, with or without support from pawn on b4, then you're going to be doing amazing. The rooks, and this is another key thing to understand about these positions, you don't need to hurry your rooks into the center. And often, if you're playing someone who's less certain about these positions, you'll often find that they'll kind of castle on one side or another, and then maybe double their rooks on the d file. And the thing about it is, with these kinds of piece setups, there's often no entry points on the d file. So the rooks can't penetrate. And in the meantime, without spending a single move on development, these rooks are ideally placed. So this rook supports the a pawn advance, sometimes all the way to a6. This rook can support the h pawn advance, and it can just hang around, it can just chill there, it doesn't have to do anything. The rooks are not as important to start with. So this is when I say time is important. One of the things that black will often waste time on in these positions is developing the rooks to the center, doubling them, while we're positioning our minor pieces. Finding the right place for the minor pieces is much more important. And the other thing to mention is this lovely compact kingside pawn structure on the long side. This is your ideal. You've strengthened your e4 point. This pawn controls these two very important squares that otherwise black would be able to put for example, a knight on. It is very hard for black to create weaknesses and attack this structure the same way it is for white to attack on the queen side. Now, one of the plans for black in these kind of structures is to make some kind of attack with the pawns along here and try and create weaknesses. But it's very difficult to do so. Often black might succeed in opening the g-file after this exchange, but then he may find that there's still no entry points on the g-file, or that he can't do anything with it. And in the meantime, white is blowing the whole queen side open. So aiming for this structure here can be very beneficial. One thing you got to be careful of is avoid the temptation to touch your h-pawn and put it there. This all of a sudden makes this lovely structure into a massive pile of weaknesses. And this can give black significant counterplay if he can start getting his minor pieces into these dark square weaknesses. So leave the h-pawn at home unless you got a good reason, is good advice usually. So that's probably enough of an intro. I don't want this to be a very long video. It's really about analysis of 3 games of mine, illustrating a fight for these key squares, and how the game can just sort of turn from what looks like equal symmetry to advantage for one side, based on the control of these squares. Okay, so the first game I want to look at is a game against Joe Varley, who's a strong young player who plays in the Yorkshire League. So this is a Yorkshire League game from March 2025. Joe is rated approximately 2100, 2150. I think he was around 2100 at the time of this game, and I think he's 2150 plus right now. So it's a Sicilian, Alpen, and Joe plays d5, which is one of the main moves. The other main move is knight f6, and then you get into different types of position after this type of thing, where white can play knight f3, can play bishop c4. So it's a different type of game. d5 is considered to be a very solid equalizing move. Now, the best move here for white is to play pawn takes, and then queen takes, and then usually you end up in some kind of isolated queen pawn position after this type of continuation, which is fine for white. But I had a bit of a brainwave. So I'm going to digress a little and go back, and I'll show you what my brainwave was based on. So I was looking at openings that go straight into the endgame, and I was looking at this move, which is fairly well known, and this ending is pretty good for black. So knight c3. The whole idea is that we restrict the white knights. So let's just play some normal moves. This is what almost always gets played. This position is already very slightly better for black. And I remember being quite surprised by this when I was looking at it, and it made me interested in other openings that go straight into an ending, or at least a queenless middle game. And the idea in these positions is black will develop this bishop here, probably at some point exchange that bishop for either this knight or maybe this bishop. He'll probably play a5. This knight will go to c5. And again, what you'll notice is you got this lovely little compact pawn structure on the long side. So basically, black has already established an ideal pawn structure here, and now he's going to position his minor pieces, and he's going to make a race for this square. And one disadvantage that white has is that this pawn here occupies a really important square that he'd rather have a knight on. And the c4 pawn therefore ends up being a weakness. It weakens his dark squares, and it needs protecting. And it takes away, very importantly, takes away an outpost for a knight on c4. So I think that's why why black can claim a small advantage in this position, because he can fight for an outpost in his territory here, which is very beneficial. Anyway, that was a bit of a long digression, but I wanted to explain my next move, which otherwise looks bizarre. So my brainwave was, well, hang on, if that endgame is good for black, then why don't I try to reach that endgame as white, a tempo up? So if black accepts the endgame here, we're now in exactly the same position, a tempo up. So I'm going to play f3, and then I'm going to have the same plan of a4, knight d2 to c4. You know, I'll probably put my bishop on e3. This bishop is going to go to b5. So that's my idea. And I have had this in a couple of games where people have accepted to go into this endgame. And it's generally been a very pleasant position. You know, white has no problems. It's got a small advantage. The engine gives it plus 0.4 in this position for white, which coming out of the opening is, you know, by modern standards, pretty much everything you could want. You know, you've got a risk-free advantage. But the problem, obviously, is that black doesn't have to take. And if he doesn't take and leaves the tension in the center, then it's actually quite good for him. So Joe played knight c6, which is very logical. You know, he doesn't want to go into that endgame. He wants to keep things complicated. So we'll play a few more moves. So at this point, so by playing knight d2, I'm kind of giving up on the idea that Joe may go into an endgame here. And I'm accepting that what I've got is some kind of King's Indian reversed position, which is fine. I play the King's Indian. I don't mind playing a reversed King's Indian. The engine thinks that black is already better here, because even though it's a King's Indian a tempo down, the engine hates the King's Indian. So it thinks, you know, the tempo is not as important as black's extra space. So it wants to play d4, you know, or knight f6 first and then d4. So we get a few moves. Knight f6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2. And now here, for some reason, Joe decides to exchange in the center, which is a bit of a mistake, according to the engine. So the engine would much rather that we play d4 here. And then you get some moves like this, castles, castles. And then we play a4. And to me, I didn't mind playing this position at all. This is, you know, a very normal type of King's Indian position. I feel comfortable here. You know, I know the plans for white. The engine thinks that black has an advantage of about half a pawn here. You know, it's a matter of opinion. Probably if you are playing white, you would rather not do this. You'd rather not play a black opening as white, you know, but I didn't mind this anyway. I wouldn't have minded playing that position. But Joe chose to try and exploit my strange opening and plunked his queen in to d3. So just trying to interfere with my plans. So yeah, I still want an endgame, and this time Joe decides the endgame is okay. Now, this is slightly less good for me than the type of ending that I was trying to get previously, because that compact ideal pawn structure on the king side is now not possible, you know, and also this bishop on g2 would really rather be on this diagonal. And in fact, it ends up having to spend a tempo and get back on that diagonal in a couple of moves. So for that reason, for the fact that we've disrupted our nice pawn structure and lost a tempo, this is not quite as good a version as we would have wanted. However, it's compensated for by the fact that black has committed to putting both of these pawns on dark squares. And what this means is that the fight for these light squares is going to be very important. You know, we already have these. And also, black does not have the opportunity to use this square as an outpost. So really, the battle is going to revolve around this key square, this key square, this key square. If I can establish solid control, first of all, of c4, then I think I'm going to be better here. So we have a little fight for the light squares now. So b6 is a very logical move. And, you know, this bishop is planning to come out here. And my king might even end up being in a little bit of trouble. So in advance of the bishop coming out, I am evacuating to my ideal square for the king, which is here. I don't have time to do what I would ideally like to do, you know, bring rook out to d1 or e1, because this move is now highly annoying and my king gets kind of trapped in the center, and this is not so great for me. So for that reason, I waste another couple of tempi maneuvering my king to c2. Bishop a6. And now I mentioned that this bishop has to come home again. And I also mentioned previously the fight for the light squares. So if I can get that light squared bishop traded off here, then black's main protector of his light squared complex is gone. So that would be very nice for me. So for that reason, Joe puts it back on b7. I'm going to skip through some of these moves fairly quickly so that we don't go on and on forever. The reason for e1 is because one of black's best plans in this position will be to try to play f5 and put pressure down the f file, because this move has weakened my protection of the f3 square. So rook e1 is kind of a bit of a prophylaxis so that in future I can take on f5 and have pressure on e5. King c2, rook e8. So black is kind of a little short of ideas here. I mentioned that one of the plans is f5, so for that reason rook f8 was logical. Another thing he can try to do is just try to hassle this bishop. This bishop is doing a lot of good things here. It's just keeping a little bit of annoying pressure here and tempting black to play this move, after which the bishop will retreat somewhere, either there, maybe here, and then the claim will be that we've achieved something by getting black to weaken his queenside pawns. Now, the engine quite likes the move a6 and isn't too worried about this weakening, but during the game, Joe basically wanted to keep his compact pawn structure intact, which is very understandable. a4, this is a really standard move in these positions. Like I said in the intro, this rook doesn't need developing. It's already on its perfect square because it wants to support this a-pawn advance. And this bishop, although it's still undeveloped, it is not yet clear where it's going to do useful work. So you don't need to develop it. You know, white's development is basically complete here. because it's not clear. Should the bishop go here? Is it going to go here? You know, what's it going to do? Maybe it even wants to come to this diagonal. The situation with the pawns needs to clarify before you can decide where this guy goes. So that's why, although it looks like white is undeveloped, in fact he's not. And in fact, you've got an equal fight going on here. So this move already says to me that black isn't sure what to do. H6 is kind of pointless because I'm not threatening to put any piece on G5. And if black wanted to play G5 himself, he can do it right away. So all H6 does is waste a tempo and potentially in future weaken the light squares over here as well. So, you know, not that big a deal, but kind of a sign that Joe's not sure what's going on here, or not sure what the best plan is, I should say. And now I played A5, which I was very happy with, but this is actually a slight mistake. So the engine would much rather that I play knight to C4 first, followed by A5. And the reason is going to become clear on the next move. Now I can't remember why I didn't play knight to C4. I might have been thinking that F5 would be awkward. You know, I might have been thinking that I needed to keep two protectors of E4. Honestly, can't remember. And it doesn't matter. So, okay, so A5. And this works out instantly very well for me. The critical move here, obviously, is for black to take the A pawn. If he doesn't do that, then I'm going to get one of two things that I want. I'm either going to be able to exchange on B6 and open the A file and create a weakness on B6, or, depending on what I want to do, I can push it onto A6, where it is going to be a permanent thorn in black's side. And this is an idea that often comes up in these positions. There are mirror images of it with, you know, the famous alpha 0 pawn, where you have a H pawn that pushes all the way to H6 and stays there. And then it turns out that even in the endgame, this creates all kinds of tactical problems for the opposing side. So you have the same thing with an A pawn. A pawns that end up on A6 often create very favorable endgames because you always have threats of a piece sacrifice on B6 with promotion ideas. So the correct move here is to take it, and then I will go takes, 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 and now I had kind of stopped calculating here, and I think Joe did too, because we could both see that I'm going to win the F pawn, and seems like my position is great. But what we missed was that black can go rook d6, and then it's actually really bad for me to play this, because now I'm getting busted. Black is actually winning here. So after rook d6, I shouldn't take that pawn. I should play f4. And I'll just give a few moves of the engine line here, because this was a little hard for humans to calculate. But we get these kinds of moves. So takes, takes, rook retreats, and I do end up picking up the A pawn. And then we end up in this position, which, you know, I don't know about you, I find this quite hard to evaluate. White has won a pawn and doesn't seem to have any problems. In fact, the engine prefers black here due to the two bishops in an open position and white's weakness on e4. So e5 is practically forced. And then you get this move. And things are actually getting quite difficult and dangerous for white here. So we didn't see any of this. We both rejected knight takes a5 due to not calculating deeply enough in this position here. So a5, bishop f8, knight c4, rook e6. So what you can see is I am absolutely clamping down now. Everything is revolving around this key c4 square. So ever since black retreated his bishop, there's been no contest. I've had full control over this outpost, and it's become an absolutely vital transit point for all my pieces. So this knight is soon going to make way. It's going to come to e4, e3. It's going to head for these juicy squares here. This knight is going to come back to c4 possibly. The bishop may even come back, transit through c4 and go to d5. So that c4 square is the key to the entire position. A knight there has just gigantic reach. It's got all of these squares deep in black's territory, and it's targeting two weaknesses and a weak square. So hopefully you can see how important that square is. So Joe starts trying to create some play here. I thought this was a big mistake because now that's another permanent light square weakness. Actually, the engine doesn't think it makes very much difference here. So a6, this gets marked as a slight inaccuracy. The engine would rather that I take on b6 and make that a weakness. But a6 is totally fine. Just play through some normal logical moves here. So you see what I said about everything transiting through c4. This is a mistake. Just for tactical reasons, this loses another pawn. But even the best move here, rook e7, and I'm still doing amazingly after knight d5. You know, we may bring this knight this way. We may end up moving the bishop and bringing this knight in this way. But basically, I just invade through the light squares, and there's not very much black can do here. So anyway, I am going to whiz through the final moves. We pick up the f7 pawn, and after this, it's really all over. There's no protection of the light squares. Even though we didn't manage to trade black's light squared bishop, it's completely useless over here. It's still biting on granite on these pawns. So as you can see, the h6 pawn is now a weakness, which we've fixed, and we're going to win it. So it's all over now, and Joe resigned here. So that's game number one. Pretty nice illustration of play on the light squares and the importance of the c4 outpost. So game number two, I'm white again, and I'm playing against Mark Crowther, who is a strong player. At the time of this game, he was rated 2180, I think, 2180 something. And again, this was in the Yorkshire League. So this was, Mark was playing board one for Bradford A team. And it was in February 2025. And let's have a look. So this was in my favorite variation of the Caro Can. which again is this early endgame offer. And there's a few different moves that black can play here, and I'm intending to do a video on this opening, so we can go into more depth there. But Mark decided to play the endgame, which I'm quite happy about. So if we stop and have a look at this position, and if you compare it to the position we looked at the very start, which is this one, you can see that this is the exact pawn structure that we were talking about. So here, white wants to set up that ideal kingside pawn formation. He wants to fight for control of these outposts. He wants to push his a pawn up the board. This bishop probably wants to come to e3. And these knights are going to position themselves c4, and then depending on what happens, this guy might come to c4, or there's another route available to come to c5 if we have the chance to do that. So that's very much what we're trying to do here, and it's black's job to disrupt our setup. And there's a few things he can do to try and do that. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into it, because it'll be the subject of another video. Bishop to g4 is one of the most frequently encountered moves, which is not very good, because one of the things white would like to achieve is to exchange these bishops. And by playing bishop to g4, essentially black is making that very easy for him. It removes one piece that can fight for this square. So this is one piece that black has that can try to stop white from establishing a secure outpost on c4. So sometimes you get these kinds of moves. And black has himself accomplished one of white's strategic goals. The light squared bishops are gone. Now, it's not massive. This is still only tiny advantage white, but I don't think it's the best way to play. Another idea for black is to try to trade the other bishops, and this is more promising. So he can try playing g6 with the idea of playing bishop h6, exchanging the bishop on c1. And again, this is quite a good plan. In fact, this is basically what Mark plays in a slightly different move order. And there are other plans as well. So there are plans for black that involve advancing these pawns. So if we look at the next couple of moves, so we are going to set up our ideal pawn chain, and one of the options black has is to chuck his g and h pawns down the board, try and get some kind of minority attack like happening, and create some weaknesses over here before white can get going over here. The downside of this plan is simply that it uses time, right? So white can use that time to get ideally set up over here, and kind of say to black, well, you can push these pawns up, but it's going to cost you 4 or 5 moves, and whatever weaknesses you can create aren't going to be that much of a worry. So it leads to an interesting game, and there's actually plenty of top-level games in that line if you're interested. But now that we've put our knight on d2, we've blocked in our dark squared bishop, and now black plays g6, which is a very good plan. So the plan again is to bring this bishop out here. So I play a4. We can play f3 straight away, but my kind of way of thinking in these positions is that a4 is always useful. So if you're not absolutely sure what move to play, just play a4. Bishop h6. Now, it's not like white still has a small advantage here, but I'm just marking this with an exclamation mark because it shows that black understands the position. He understands something about which minor pieces should be kept and which should be traded. So it's a good plan. F3. Now, castling is actually not so great here. The engine would like bishop e6 here, and then so this is what the engine thinks we should play. The best line, bishop c4. So white is going to get his beneficial exchange at the cost of the unbeneficial exchange. So essentially, the bishops are all going to come off the board here, and we're going to get a position with just the knights, where again white has retained a very small advantage because he already has his knight on the perfect square, and it's only 2 moves for his other knight to come and contest the other perfect square. But in the meantime, black is going to also develop and try and come into these squares. So, you know, it's a position. Some of the plans are the same, but definitely less favorable for white when he doesn't have an e3 bishop here. The bishop, when it can get itself parked here, it does a lot of work, especially the pressure on a7 can be very useful. Whereas in this position with just the knights, there's nothing really hindering black developing and bringing his rooks to the center. So that's what the engine would rather play. The engine would rather play bishop e6 here. Mark decided to castle, which is very logical. It's just that in this type of endgame, castling is one reason for castling is to put your king in safety, and the other reason is to develop your rook. So developing the rook is fairly logical here, but there was no need to make the king safe. It's already safe. And it's even possible for black in these positions, instead of castling and bringing his king away from the action, he can often consider walking the king from d8 to c7, where it actually helps on the queen side, and then allows the rook to develop. And that can end up actually being better than castling. So I would consider castling to be a small mistake in this position. Okay, so now the reason for knight a3, like obviously I can straight away go about my plan here and put the knight on c4, but I just wanted to see what happens if I don't straight away allow the exchange of dark squared bishops. You know, I just wasn't sure. I thought if I just leave this knight here for a while and maybe bring the other knight into the c4 outpost, you know, maybe this bishop on h6 ends up not being so good. And I could even think of plans sometime in the future involving pushing these pawns, in which case the h6 bishop would be a target and might have to move. Now, I wasn't sure about this because one problem, obviously, of pushing these pawns is that you're going to create weaknesses. So this would be very circumstantial as to whether this was a good idea. But essentially, I just wanted to prolong the strategic fight for the dark squared bishop exchange here. So that's why I decided to fight for this square with knight a3. So rook d8, very logical. c3, we're trying to put our king on the ideal square. Knight d7, king c2, knight c5. So this is an interesting moment. Black has a choice of what to do with this knight, and he can either develop it to what looks like its ideal outpost on c5. So since we're talking about trying to control these squares, it looks like black should occupy this square. Or he can put it here with the idea of trying to disrupt some of my control of the c4 square. I think this might have been slightly better. If you look at the position after the next move, so this is a really critical moment. And you see I've drawn some arrows here. We both have our knights on our outpost squares, and we both have possibilities of b-pawn pushes here. And the problem for black is that, for very concrete reasons, b5 doesn't work for him in this position, whereas b4 is unstoppable for me. So what that means is that if b5 is not possible for black here, then I have won the battle for the key squares on the queen side, which is the theme of the video, right? So I have managed to establish rock solid control of the c4 square with 3 of my minor pieces, and I am going to get in b4 next move and drive this knight back. So everything, the evaluation of this position really revolves around whether black can play b5 here. And Mark thought he could. And it turned out after the game that Mark thought that he was better in this position. So his evaluation was probably something like that white is behind on development. You know, he's spent some tempi on moves like a4, f3, king c2. Black is the first to have a rook on the center file, and you know, if he opens the queen side with b5, he's going to have a dangerous attack on my king. So that's like a very logical way of thinking about the position. And if he was right about all those things, then he would be right about the evaluation. So it all revolves around this little tactic, which we'll now look at. So if black doesn't play b5 here, so let's say he plays another move. Let's say he plays bishop e6. I'm going to play b4. This knight really has no choice. Got to come back to d7. And now I can kind of do quite a lot of different moves here, which don't change the evaluation at all. Essentially, I kind of have won the initial strategic battle by establishing this outpost. I've got this very powerful knight, which is fully supported, and I can choose what to do next. So one plan that's very thematic is this knight to go to b3, where it adds additional control to these squares. This does involve allowing the dark squared bishop trade, but at this point that's probably okay. Or we can prolong that. We can simply develop. We can play bishop e2, bring this rook to the center, you know, let this bishop hang out on h6 for a bit longer. So, you know, the game goes on. Black is not lost or anything. It's just that white has won the initial battle on the queen side. So Mark played b5. And like I said, this would be very good if not for the following mini tactic, which is a little unfortunate. So white wins a pawn. And the game remains complicated, but a pawn is a pawn. So we picked up the a7 pawn. And now there's another little important detail here. So there's only really one way for black to keep the advantage small. So the engine is giving this as an advantage of half a pawn, which means that it thinks black has quite a lot of compensation for being a pawn down, but you have to find the right move. And the reason for the compensation is something that neither Mark nor myself considered. So if black finds this move, then things are not quite so bad for him. But obviously, we had both dismissed this move because it looks like b4 wins a piece. This knight is attacked. This knight is hanging from the rook. But it turns out that after this sequence of moves, black gets significant compensation. So knight a4, takes knight, knight takes c3, the king gets out of the way of the rook. Excellent move. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes bishop, and so white is going to try and unravel by bringing this bishop to g2, but essentially in this position, despite being a piece down, the engine thinks that black has almost full compensation. Now this is really, really hard. I mean, I don't know, maybe for grandmasters, they would be able to look at this position from 5, 6, 7 moves out and think, evaluate this as being sufficient compensation for a piece. I don't know if I would. I think I would willingly head for this position as white, thinking that I'm a piece up and I'm probably going to win fairly quickly. It looks to me like this rook manages to escape from the back rank. It looks like this knight can shore things up by coming to c5. So this is what Mark would have had to play into to keep the game sort of within the realms of not quite equality, but close to. So what actually happened in the game? E6. And now I'm going to go through the rest of the game fairly quickly. I'm going to pause at 1 or 2 moments, but essentially the story of the rest of the game is me unraveling, getting my pieces developed, and eventually finding a way to advance my passed pawn on the queen side, and trading pieces. White wants to trade pieces in this position, while black wants to keep the game complicated and hopefully generate threats against my king. So I'll play a few moves which are very logical for both sides. So things are looking a little dangerous here. It looks like black has a significant initiative, and this was probably the most difficult move in the game for me. It's not at all clear how to calm the position down and get things simplifying, because it looks like black has full control of the queen side. But in fact, if you look at our key squares, returning to the theme of this video, there is a square on the queen side that we have very good control of, and that is the b5 square. So even though the black rooks are doubled on this file, we have 2 minor pieces hitting this square. If we were able to add a third piece, then we would be able to block on this square and disrupt the entire attacking mechanism that black has set up. So basically that's the reasoning behind this move. We take the rook off the 7th rank, and black can't stop us chucking it in here, which basically kills the entire attack. It's dead. Without the doubled rooks here, black doesn't have any attacking initiative and doesn't have any threats against the king. So that was it. I was very happy to find that move, and there's not really anything that black can do. So let's play some more moves. He now can't avoid these trades, so his knight is stranded on b3, so he's got to get it out somehow. And all these trades are good for me. Every set of pieces that comes off brings us closer to an endgame where this b pawn is going to win. So rook comes back to the open file. Now, again, black can't avoid trades here. So if black leaves the rook where it is, then my rook is going to come down to the 7th, and there's going to be very dangerous threats along here, probably unstoppable threats against f7. So really he's forced to contest the 2nd rank, but now I get to trade the rooks. So we're now down to just 2 minor pieces, and the pawn is on b5. So it's like the Death Star. It's not really possible to stop it now. Pick up another pawn. Otherwise, it's very difficult for black to get his pieces into the game. trade down. Now we're just left with the knights. And at this point, Mark had seen enough and he resigned. So, quite a smooth game, but with some very interesting moments. Again, all coming down to this fight for these key squares. Final game is yet another Yorkshire League game against James Hunt from, I think, Leeds Chess Club. So this was in October 2024, and I was playing on board 2. And I was black this time. So let's take a look. So what this is going to be an example of is, once again, a fight for the c4 square, but this time from the point of view of black successfully contesting this square. So it starts off as a Sicilian with this kind of slow bishop e2 move, which can be quite good. So it's a delayed Alapin. The tactical point here is that knight takes e4 loses to queen a4 check. So now that I'm castled, I'm threatening to take the e-pawn. White's entire plan involves getting d4 in at a point when he can keep his e4 and d4 pawn duo. And my entire plan is to try to stop him from doing that comfortably. So, protects the e-pawn. Knight c6. Now here, this really is White's chance to get his move in. So he should play d4. We will take it. And then we're going to play this. And this is what James didn't want to allow, because this makes things slightly awkward in the center. We're threatening to take here, which would give White the choice of disrupting his kingside pawn structure or giving up the d-pawn. So, you know, probably has to play d5, after which we can play this. Takes, and now, according to the engine, this is slightly better for black. So we have a monster g7 bishop. We have a knight that has access to these lovely squares. We will carve out a permanent square for ourselves on c5, and also our rook is going to be first to the c file. So we got a lot going for us in this position. And for this reason, James played h3, which is a move that you see in this line a lot. So basically, White doesn't want to allow bishop g4. So I played e5, which is fine here. This is a good plan. You know, we're still trying to clamp down on the d4 square. White plays d4 anyway. And now I should trade. So I made a mistake here. I played knight h5, which gives White the chance to set up a big advantage. What I should do is take everything in the center and play rook e8. And apparently this is better for black. So I have a concrete threat to take on e4 with the discovered attack on the queen. So White has to deal with that threat. And in the meantime, I've got free development, and I don't know, from looking at this position from afar, when I was calculating it, I wasn't sure about this weak pawn here. I thought that White might be able to consolidate, protect his e4 pawn, and then pile up on my d pawn. So I guess you could say I didn't evaluate this position correctly when I was looking at it during the game. You know, now I sort of have gone a bit deeper into studying this opening, and I know that this is something I should go for. But at the time, I thought this looked logical. So I thought we might be heading towards a kind of a King's Indian structure. I did see that d5 was going to be the best move for white here, and I assumed that something like this would happen. So I assumed that white would play c4 with the intention of knight c3, bishop e3 type moves, and we would get into a typical King's Indian type structure, and that I would play for f5. And I was going to be happy playing this position. You know, I like King's Indian positions. But what I had missed was that in these types of positions, white should not play c4. So that's the whole thing. So on our theme of key squares, you should not occupy your key square with a pawn if you can avoid it. So what white should play here is a4, carve out that key square, prevent black from playing b5, and this knight is going to come to c4, and it's going to be a monster. So we are going to have a permanent problem with our weak pawn on d6. Once the knight is on c4, then white is going to play for an attack on the queen side, and it's going to be a very pleasant position. So we both missed this. Lucky for me. So what James decided to do in this position was to trade into an endgame, which is perfectly fine for white, by the way. The engine doesn't mind this at all. Gives it about plus 0.6. Says this endgame is good for white. So if you compare this to the two previous games we looked at, we should understand that it's not very favorable for me to have these two pawns here in this type of an endgame. We don't have the ability to occupy our ideal knight outpost on c5, whereas white can put a knight on c4. And this is going to be what the fight revolves around for the next few moves. So I was aware that, you know, the c4 square is very important here. And I was aware that I potentially was going to have problems on the light squares if white played this well. So queens came off, and now straight away white makes a minor inaccuracy, one which is understandable. So this knight on h5 wants to go to f4, where it will be quite powerful, and if white wants to get rid of it, he's going to have to play bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4, and then this bishop gets quite strong. So that's the idea. Now, in fact, if we play some moves like this, so first of all, it's now not possible for me to put the knight in immediately because this pawn is attacked. So I got to protect that. And now, after something like a4, knight f4, the computer is not really bothered about this knight. So it says, no problem, just leave it there, put your pieces on good squares, and what's this guy doing? You know, one of the natural routes for the knight is blocked off. So because of this pawn on c3, if we were playing a normal King's Indian, this pawn would be on c4. This would be a big hole, and this knight would go this way. So the fact that this pawn on c3 is on c3 really kind of interferes with a lot of black's most natural moves and makes this whole knight h5 plan pretty bad. But James wanted to prevent the knight coming to f4, so he played g3. Now, there's nothing horribly wrong with this move. The only thing really wrong with it is time. It is a waste of a move. There was no need to stop the knight coming to f4, which means that James has lost one move for fighting for the key square on the queen side. And that's enough to bring the position back to somewhere around equality. And the main reason for this is because in addition to the tempo wasted on g3, you will notice that the h3 pawn now needs protection. And this bishop, because it's one of the pieces that has to protect the c4 square, will be overworked unless the h3 pawn is protected. So essentially what that all means is that white is going to have to spend another tempo protecting this pawn in order to fight for the key squares. So I thought for about 20 minutes here and I came up with a move I was fairly happy with. So I realized that we were fighting for this square. I wanted to play my bishop to e6, but bishop e6 immediately runs into knight g5. And unless I want to give this guy up, which I don't, then he's going to have to retreat. So that's no good. So I realized that I had this extra tempo. I realized that white is not actually threatening to put the bishop on c4 straight away. So h6, preventing knight g5, preparing bishop e6. So one of the themes of this game is moves made over on the king side being relevant for the fight for the queen side squares. So white spends his tempo. He protects h3. Bishop e6. Knight a3. Fighting for c4. Knight a5. Fighting for c4. Knight d2. Fighting for c4. And now there's an important moment here. So I play a move here that works out extremely well for me, but shouldn't have. So what I should do here, apparently, is I should acknowledge that for now, with his three minor pieces aiming at c4 against my two, that white has temporarily won the fight for this key square. So what the engine would like me to do is to play my knight back towards the center, allow white to occupy the square, and play this knight back. Now it looks like we are retreating, but in fact we're coming back. So the way to play this position now is black is going to play for a6, b5, and he is going to play knight e8 to d6. So we are still fighting for the c4 square. It's just we've had to make a tactical retreat. So this is the way the engine wanted to play the position. Now what I did was a little bit too active. So I played f5, which immediately works out amazingly for me. But what white should do here, and it's interesting to compare this to the previous variation. So he should take, and then he should, well, there's two moves he can do here. There's an engine move and a human move, right? The engine move is to sack a pawn with knight b3, which is really crazy. And we get this position. I'm just going to show you this because I don't think either of us would have thought of this. The knight comes to c4, and white is clearly better. Okay, he's a pawn down. He's clearly better. I would find this impossible to play in a real game. But instead of this, he can just play his knight in, and we can play our knight back to c6. And unlike the previous variation, our kingside pawn structure has been a bit weakened, and this knight is still way off on h5. So this knight still has to make a journey back here to fight for the c4 square. And based on this, white is better here. So this is what he should have played. And what he actually played, I've actually marked this as a blunder. It is a positional blunder that loses the fight for the c4 square. Which is weird because, you know, like I said, actions on the king side are affecting squares on the queen side. But it's for a very specific, concrete reason. So after f3, the point about f3 is it's not necessary to play this move, right? Nothing. I'm not threatening anything with f5. So even if you don't take, you can still just plonk a knight on c4. Protecting the e4 pawn is not necessary, and it makes my next move stronger. So I play f4, and I'm already clear advantage here according to the engine. So we've gone from small advantage white, about plus 0.3 or so, to minus 1.5, believe it or not. We've nearly had a 2-point evaluation swing here. And the reason is that after g4, knight g3, all of a sudden that light squared bishop can't avoid being traded. And with that, white loses the fight for the c4 square. And with that, he comes under a clear disadvantage. So to me, this is kind of amazing, right? Since the topic of the video is the fight for key squares, it's rare to see such a clear example of how losing the fight for a key square can have such massive consequences. But we're going to see it over the next 10 moves, because loss of control of this square basically removes all white's counterplay and black's space advantage becomes unstoppable. So the point is that bishop c4, which, you know, would otherwise be desirable, you know, to at least trade the bishop for one of these pieces attacking the c4 square, is not possible, because we play rook takes d2 check, and we are now winning. We have two pieces for a rook and a just monstrous position. White can't even contest the d file, because if he puts a rook on d1, we're going to be able to bring our bishop into e2. So this would be a disaster. And because of that, this f1 bishop can't avoid being traded. So knight c4. And an interesting moment here. There's actually only one good move. So if we exchange on c4, we then allow the bishop out of jail. So if I play knight takes c4 here, all of a sudden I've lost my opportunity and we're back to equality, because the bishop trades itself for one of the critical pieces in the position. So the only good move here is to retreat the knight. And in general, this falls into the category of that the side with the space advantage wants to avoid exchanges. And again, we've temporarily conceded control of the key square, but we're coming back. b3 makes sense. b8. So we're preparing b5. So this is what I said. We're coming back and we're going to take control of that square. Ultimately, although white has currently 1, 2, 3 defenders of this outpost here, that is going to be our square. So knight b2, now he has 4 defenders of that square, but it doesn't matter. So now we chop the bishop, and we play b5. So although we don't yet control the square, we have now removed white's ability to use it as a transit point for his pieces. So even just visually, we can now see that white is in a box. So I decided this was a good moment to open the H file so that I could bring my rooks into the position. Apparently this is a slight inaccuracy, and the engine would like us to straight away occupy the key square with a pawn. I didn't really want to do this. I'm not sure what I thought during the game, whether I thought that b4 would be good. I can see the point here is that apparently this is now devastating. And that is quite nice. That is quite nice. So takes. Yeah. White's pieces are all in a muddle. We are threatening to go d3, d2, winning a piece. Our bishop has been woken up. This bishop is monstrous. So this would have been quite nice, actually. I didn't see this in the game. I thought c4, d4 would slow me up a bit. Sorry, c4, b4. Here. Although, you know, looking at it now, even if we don't have this tactic, we've still got this, and we've got a huge position. Anyway, what I played is totally fine. It's just not the strongest move. So king e2, king f7. We'll go through some of these moves fairly quickly. Takes. So unfortunately for white, he can't trade the rooks here because he loses a pawn with g takes f3 check. And I get to invade on the h file. So this really, you know, there's too many threats for white to deal with here. So he does his best to try and hold it together. But too many threats. So as you can see, we're still within the theme of fighting for key squares. c4. And now, very thematic. Boom! The point being that this move is impossible because we have checkmate. So we've won another pawn and we've occupied the key square in a very emphatic manner. So I'll just last couple of moves, and at this point black lost on time. Sorry, white lost on time, but it's completely lost. There's nothing he can do here. We are a pawn up and his pieces are all completely tied down. So that's it. So not sure what to say by way of wrapping up, other than the process of understanding these kinds of positions was really educational for me. I think I've said before, I've said on a previous video that I used to avoid these kinds of positions. So I used to avoid queenless middle games, and I used to avoid symmetrical positions. And now I feel like I understand them much better, and I understand particularly one of the new understandings I came to was the importance of, you know, fighting for key squares, but also the time element in fighting for key squares. You know, the idea that you shouldn't wait around, that even though the position is symmetrical and the queens are off, actually you need to hurry to put your minor pieces in the right positions. And if you don't, and if you allow the opponent to occupy the key squares first, then you are going to have a lot of trouble. So in symmetrical positions, time is very important. Now, if both players hurry and if both players play the correct moves, understand the key squares to fight for, and oppose each other correctly, you're going to have equality very roughly. One side might have the initiative, but what I've found, for example, in those Caro-Can positions that we looked at, is that if black patiently maneuvers, fights for the c5 and c4 squares, exchanges knights, exchanges bishops correctly, then you will eventually end up at a kind of a drawn position. It's still very nice to play because black has to defend extremely accurately to get there. So that's it. I guess I am going to stop there. I hope this has been fun and interesting. It was certainly an education for me, both playing these games and then analysing them afterwards with the computer. And, hopefully you get to use some of these ideas in your own games. And see you next. I do have something I need to say, actually. I'm going to be playing a tournament in Bradford in a week's time. So it's I think it's the first Bradford Congress. I think there used to be an annual Bradford Chess Congress, and I don't know how long it hasn't been running for, but it's been reinstated now as part of the White Rose chess circuit. So I'm going to be playing that January the 3rd and 4th, I think. Saturday and Sunday, 5 rounds. And I will definitely be doing a tournament recap. Hopefully I'll have some photos to show from it. And, I'll be trying to win it, but there's going to be a lot of strong players there as well. Some, there's probably going to be more than one 2200 rated player. So, yeah, going to be interesting. Going to be fun. First tournament of the new year. And first tournament since I started this channel. So stay tuned for the results and see you soon.